Hey, good morning, guys. Good to see you. Glad you're with us. Hope you had a wonderful Thanksgiving holiday. Maybe you were able to get together with some family or friends and just take a few moments and be thankful for what God has done in our life over this last year and up until this point in our life. I am thankful that you're with me today, that you're watching and joining in the Bible study. We're going to be in 2 Corinthians chapter 11. We're starting that this week. We've got two more chapters after this, and then we're done with the book of 2 Corinthians, and then we'll make some decisions about what the future looks like for our Bible study here on Sunday morning. So this is November the 28th, 2021, and I'm so glad that you're with us. As a quick recap, we finished chapter 10 last week, and the big idea behind chapter 10, as Paul wrapped it up, he compared the right way to measure a ministry and the wrong way to measure a ministry. And of course, the wrong way was by measuring it based on the thoughts, the attitudes, the opinions of men. We talked about how the Corinthian church and those who were against Paul basically made fun of him because he was a shorter guy. He kind of had crooked legs, had a broken nose, had a unibrow. He was bald-headed. He was anything but what the world would consider to be attractive. And there were many people in the Corinthian church, because they valued good-looking, good-speaking, well-educated, well-dressed, economically successful people. They gave them greater honor than they did the Apostle Paul. And so they were struggling like many of the churches today struggle with. They were exalting the wrong people for the wrong reasons. And Paul kind of said, that's not how you measure the value, the worth, the success, the legitimacy of a ministry. You measure it by glorifying God. And he finishes chapter 10 with the phrase, let him who glories glory in the Lord. In other words, Paul said, the measure of successful ministry is, does it bring glory to the kingdom? Does it bring glory to the Lord? And is your life and the standard by which you judge others one that God would use in judging others and their faithfulness? And so anyway, that finishes up chapter 10. Then he comes into chapter 11, and he's still having to defend his apostleship. You would think by this point, in his ministry, the one thing that he would not have to defend was his apostleship. And yet, false teachers can be so insidious in the church. Satan understands that if you take out the head, you don't have to worry about the body. And so Paul is again defending his apostleship here in chapter 11. And he starts off really kind of being sarcastic. Let me just read it out of the NASB, and then we'll do some verse-by-verse study. Chapter 11, verse 1, Paul says, I wish you would bear with me in a little foolishness. Not that he was being foolish, but it was this sarcastic kind of, you consider me a fool? That's fine. Bear with me in my foolishness. He was basically giving back to them what they were giving to him. He says, but indeed you are bearing with me. Verse 2, for I am jealous for you with a godly jealousy. For I betrothed you to one husband, that to Christ I might present you as a pure virgin. Verse 3, but I am afraid, lest as the serpent deceived Eve by his craftiness or his trickery, that your minds should be led astray from the simplicity and purity of devotion to Christ. For Jesus whom we have not preached, verse 4, for if one comes and preaches another Jesus whom we have not preached, or you receive a different spirit which you have not received, or a different gospel which you have not accepted, you bear this beautifully. Verse 5, for I consider myself not in the least inferior to the most eminent apostles. Again, you just hear the sarcasm here. But even if I am unskilled in speech, yet am not so in knowledge. In fact, in every way we have made this evident to you in all things. Verse 7, or did I commit a sin in humbling myself that you might be exalted because I preached the gospel of God to you without charge? Verse 8, I robbed other churches, taking wages from them to serve you. And when I was present with you and was in need, I was not a burden to anyone. For when the brethren came from Macedonia, they fully supplied my need, and in everything I kept myself from being a burden to you and will continue to do so. And so let's stop right there. In verse 1, he says, I wish that you would bear with me in a little foolishness. But indeed, you are bearing with me. He calls it foolishness because he does it reluctantly, knowing his time and effort could be spent on far better things. The reality of it is Paul has reached a point where he is just absolutely put out with the Corinthian church. He has instructed them. He has modeled Christ for them. He has encouraged them. He has pled with them. He has begged with them. And they still continue to attack the messenger who is bringing the message of hope and salvation. And so he's just reached a point, and he says, it is probably absolute foolishness for me to continue to argue with you about these things. He knows that the things he believed were honorable about his apostleship and would be regarded as foolish by some of the Corinthian Christians. He says, and indeed you do bear with me. One might ask, Paul, if you think this is a little foolishness, why bother with it at all? Yet it is worth it for the reasons Paul is getting ready to explain in the rest of the passage. And so you can imagine maybe there are times you can remember with your children or grandchildren, maybe if you're a teacher, have been in a teaching environment, you just get so frustrated with those who are unwilling to learn. And it's not that they can't learn, it's that they're unwilling to learn. And it's almost like saying, listen, I have told you over and over and over and over, and you still refuse to listen to what I have to say. But Paul doesn't give up. In spite of the frustration, in spite of the aggravation, he continues to make the argument of his apostleship. And here's why I think he does it. Those in the Corinth church who were never going to like him, the false teachers, those stirring up division, he knew he was never going to win them to the right way. But there were others in the Corinthian church, young believers, new believers, who were sincerely seeking the truth. And they had the false teachers on one ear and they had Paul in the other ear. And Paul says, you know what? I'm not going to give up. I'm not going to hand you over to the false doctrines and the false theology and the false teaching of those who have come in to try to destroy you. I'm going to continue to argue my point so that you will know the truth. And so here Paul then goes into, once again, talking about his apostolic credentials, why they should listen to him, and what his role was as an apostle. In verse 2, he says, for I am jealous for you with a godly jealousy. For I betrothed you to one husband to present you as a pure virgin to Christ. But I'm afraid that as the serpent deceived Eve by his trickery, your minds will be led astray from sincere and pure devotion to Christ. For if one comes and preaches another Jesus whom we have not preached, or you receive a different spirit which you have not received, or a different gospel which you have not accepted, this you tolerate very well. Let's just start at the beginning with this. For I am jealous for you with a godly jealousy. It's important that the Corinthian Christians understand and trust Paul's apostolic credentials, because Paul is jealous with a godly jealousy for their hearts, for their success, for their long-term viability in Jesus. Paul's godly jealousy is a good thing. And he would be offended if the Corinthians are seduced by false understanding of what being apostle is all about. The commentator Redpath, he puts it like this, and I'm basically just going to read from his commentary because he does such a good job here. He says, human jealousy is a vice, but the Lord said in Exodus chapter 20, verse 5, I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God. God's jealousy is love in action. You see, man's jealousy is this desiring in a negative way something someone else has. Paul refuses to share the Corinthian Christians with the false teachers. Paul is saying, I am jealous for you. I am jealous for your loyalty. I'm jealous for your security. I'm jealous for your salvation. And those are not negative things, because just like God refuses to share the human heart with any rival. Not because God is selfish and wants us all for himself, but because he knows that upon that loyalty to him depends our very moral life and success as Christians. God is not jealous of us. God is jealous for us. And there's a huge difference. And that's why it's important when Paul says, I am jealous for you with a godly jealousy. God's jealousy, therefore, again, still reading from Redpath, God's jealousy, therefore, is a concern for holiness, a concern for integrity, a concern for purity of ethics, a concern for Christian standards for his people. God knows that his great purpose for us, for purity and holiness of life, depends on our personal surrender and submission to his purpose. And so Paul is saying, look, I'm jealous for you to live the right way, with the right heart, with the right influence, just as God is jealous for you, not of you, but for you, so that your life will be successful. He goes on to say in that verse, he says, for I have betrothed you to one husband, that I might present you as a pure virgin to Christ. It's important that the Corinthian Christians understand and trust Paul's apostolic credentials, because Paul is like the friend of the groom who watches out for the bride in the period between the betrothal and the wedding. So in the ancient tradition of Jewish culture, when a young man would propose to his bride, he would go to the bride's home, he would make an arrangement with the father, he would pay the dowry, and then he would leave and go prepare the place where they were to live. And so at some unannounced time, he would return and collect his bride. Well, in the meantime, while he was gone, the bride would begin to make all of the arrangements that were necessary for the marriage ceremony, preparing her gown, preparing her dowry, the veil, and preparing herself for what would eventually be her role as wife and mother and keeper of the home. And so the friend of the bridegroom would be responsible for having communication between the groom and the bride. He would be responsible for kind of watching out for her integrity. He would be responsible for making sure that she had everything that she needed, that she was well taken care of, because when she was betrothed to be married, she, for all practical purposes, became the responsibility of the bridegroom. And so Paul is saying, I'm serving that same role for you in Christ. Christ has betrothed you to himself. You will be his bride. You are precious to him. He has gone away to prepare for you a heavenly home one day. And in the meantime, I'm here as an apostle of the gospel, as a friend of the bridegroom, to communicate to you, to protect you, to guide you, to encourage you, to make sure that you're not led astray. And so Paul is seeing himself in this role. Paul considers himself a friend of Jesus the bridegroom, and he will do his best to present the bride as a pure virgin to Christ on their wedding day, when the Corinthian Christians will one day stand before Jesus. Quoting from a dictionary, a biblical dictionary, it says, because this is referenced in John 3, chapter 3, verse 29, in the Jewish culture of the day, the friend of the bridegroom had an important job. He was to procure a husband for the virgin, to guard her, to bear testimony of her marital endowments and faithfulness. And it was upon this testimony of the friend that the bridegroom would choose the bride. Remember also that the time of betrothal wasn't taken lightly in Paul's culture. If someone was unfaithful during the betrothal period, it was considered adultery, and the betrothal could be broken by divorce. You know, anytime we give our hearts to something other than God, we are committing spiritual adultery during the period of our betrothal. And this is exactly what was happening in the Corinthian church. They had accepted Christ as their Savior. They were married to Him spiritually, and there were false teachers who were causing them to commit spiritual adultery. And Paul is saying, I am going to be jealous for you with a godly jealousy. I'm going to protect you. You have been betrothed to Christ, to one husband, and I'm going to do my dead level best to make sure that when you meet Jesus one day, you will be pure in spirit. He goes on to say, but I am afraid. It's important that the Corinthian Christians understand and trust Paul's apostolic credentials, because Paul knows the subtle nature of Satan's deceptions. The bottom line is this: the Corinthian Christians, by and large, did not admire Paul's apostolic credentials because they thought of him in a worldly way, not with the mind of Jesus. They didn't like Paul's apparent weakness and unimpressive appearance. This was an important point because Paul's apparent weakness was also shared by Jesus. If you remember in Philippians chapter 2, 6 through 8, this is what it says about Jesus. Jesus, who being in the form of God, did not consider it robbery to be equal with God, but made himself of no reputation, taking the form of a bondservant and coming in the likeness of men. And having been found in the appearance of a man, Jesus humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even death on the cross. It wasn't only the apostolic credentials of Paul that were under attack. It was the very nature of Jesus. And so Paul says, as the serpent deceived Eve in his treachery, or with his trickery, Paul is using Eve as a reminder that Satan is in the business of half-truths. And though a lie may seem to be true, it is still a lie. For he who comes preaches another Jesus. Paul knows that they are attracted to the false apostles who preach another Jesus. The troublemakers among the Corinthian Christians who stirred up contention against Paul didn't just attack Paul, they also attacked the true Jesus by preaching another Jesus. So who was this other Jesus? Because of the way the Corinthian Christians despised Paul's image of weakness and unimpressive appearance, the other Jesus was probably someone who knew no weaknesses. Persecution, humiliation, suffering, and death. And that's a lie that's still being used today, isn't it? Follow Jesus and you will have the happiness of life. You'll have an easy life. You'll never have to have trouble. You'll never have suffering. You'll never have times of discouragement. Jesus will solve all of your problems and you will never have to sacrifice or suffer to follow him. That is the lie of the enemy. That was the lie in the Garden of Eden, that Satan could offer Eve something better than what God had already given her. It was the lie in the day of Paul in the Corinthian church that Jesus was not enough. And it is the lie today that Satan still uses, that you're missing out when you walk in the righteousness of God through Christ Jesus, that somehow you're sacrificing joy and happiness that the world offers that God is unwilling to give to you. And yet that is the exact opposite of the truth. True joy, true happiness, true satisfaction in life is only found in Jesus as we walk with him, rejecting the things of the world. If he who comes, an apostle is one who's sent. The troublemakers were the exact opposite of apostles. One could say of them, he who comes. Of an apostle, one could say one who is sent of God. These false apostles had not been sent by God. They simply came into the Corinthian church. Our church today, the modern church, has the same problem. It's not surprising that there are false teachers in today's church. The problem is that the church puts up with them and embraces them. Christians of this generation, like Christians of many generations before us, will have to answer to Jesus for their lack of discernment when it comes to the false teachers and the leaders who they have accepted and embraced into the church and allow the deception of the enemy to enter in. Okay, so we're going to stop here today. We're right at the 21-minute mark, and I don't want to go beyond that. Like I've said a few previous weeks, that we're finding that our viewership sticks much better if we stop at 20 minutes than go all the way into 30 minutes. So next week, we're going to pick up with 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 5 through 9, and the idea that Paul's humility is foolishness. So, all right. Well, God bless you guys. I love you, and we will see you next Sunday.